Montana Territory, August 1883, the sun was barely up, gold bleeding through the tall pines when he saw her barefoot beside the tracks, a baby in her arms, and dust streaked across her skirt like old bruises. Malcolm North slowed his horse to a walk, the saddle creaking under him as he took in the sight. She looked no older than 20, worn thin but upright, a stubborn sort of grace in the way she held her chin up. The child on her hip was small, probably under a year, wrapped in a faded quilt that had seen too many nights under open sky. She glanced at him once, quick and guarded, then kept walking. "Ma'am," Malcolm called gently, pulling his horse alongside her. "You all right?" She did not answer at first. The wind stirred her hair long, dark, and tangled from the road. "I ain't looking for trouble," she said finally, her voice hoarse. "Just headed west, on foot," he asked. With a baby, her jaw tensed. She shifted the child higher, the motion practiced but tired. "No choice left." Malcolm looked down the tracks, nothing but empty rails stretching into horizon. "Where you coming from? Does it matter?" she asked, not meeting his eyes. He looked at her again, really looked this time. The baby had a feverish sheen to its face. The woman's dress was torn near the hem, her feet cracked from walking too long on gravel. "Hop on," he said, easing his horse to a stop. "There's a town 7 miles up. Doctor, food, bed, I'll take you." She hesitated, arms tightening around the child. "I ain't after anything," Malcolm said. "You and the baby need help. Let me give it." She looked up at him then, the first real look. Her eyes were green, sharp with pride and something else underneath. Fear maybe, or hope. "I'm Laurel," she said slowly. "Laurel Grady. This here's my boy, Theo." Malcolm nodded once. "Malcolm North. You can ride up front with me. We'll be in Ash Hollow before noon." She shifted Theo into one arm and reached up with the other. He leaned down, caught her hand, and helped her onto the saddle. She settled in front of him, stiff at first, wary. But she held the baby close, and the moment Malcolm clicked to start the horse walking again, she let out a breath that sounded like it had been locked in her chest a long while. They rode in silence for a while, save for the soft clop of hooves and Theo fussing against her shoulder. "You got folks in Ash Hollow?" Malcolm asked. Laurel shook her head. "Nowhere left. My husband died last winter. Cough took him fast. We were in Cheyenne then, but I could not stay. Too many bad memories and not enough work." Malcolm said nothing, just watched the way she rubbed Theo's back with small, slow circles. "You got family?" she asked. He nodded. "Younger sister down in Helena. I was heading to check in on her, but I can spare a day or two." "You do this for every stranger you pass?" she asked, half defensive. "No, just the ones walking beside the tracks with a baby." Laurel blinked. Then, for the first time, a small smile crept across her face. "Lucky me then." It was near midday when they reached Ash Hollow, a small town pressed flat against the prairie, wind pushing through the single dusty street like it owned the place. Malcolm helped her down and walked her straight to the doctor's house, a squat building with whitewashed walls and a line of herbs drying on the porch. Doc Lanson was gruff but kind. He took one look at Theo and ushered them all inside. After a quiet hour and a bowl of stew, Theo's fever broke. Laurel sat beside him, her fingers stroking his hair as the child slept. Malcolm waited outside, leaning against the porch rail, chewing a piece of straw. When Laurel came out, she looked different. Still tired, still hollowed out around the eyes, but there was something steadier in her now. Like she could breathe again. "Doc says he just needs rest and food," she said. "Nothing worse." "Good," Malcolm said. She hesitated. "I do not have money to pay him." "I already did," Malcolm said, shrugging. "Do not worry about it." Laurel stared at him. "Why?" He looked at her, then down at the ground. "Because someone should." Something tightened in her face, and she turned away, blinking hard. They stayed 2 nights in Ash Hollow. Malcolm paid for a room at the boarding house down the street and slept in the barn to give Laurel and Theo space. He brought her food from the cafe and milk for the baby from the general store. Each day, she softened a little more. She began to talk about growing up on a farm outside Omaha, about her husband Nathan, about how she had once dreamed of being a schoolteacher before life took a different path. "I used to be different," she said one evening, sitting on the edge of the porch, Theo asleep in a cot behind her. "Not so hard, not so scared." Malcolm sat beside her, boots planted in the dirt. You are not hard, you just had to survive. She looked over, eyes meeting his. You are kind, Malcolm North, he smiled. You are strong, Laurel Grady. The third morning she stood beside the barn, Theo bundled in her arms, her bag slung over her shoulder. You heading out? Malcolm asked, heart sinking a little. I thought I might find work in Great Falls, she said. Just need to keep moving, he nodded slowly. I could ride that way, she blinked. You said Helena. Changed my mind. Laurel looked at him for a long moment, then very quietly, you do not have to. I know, he said, but I want to. Her lips parted slightly like she might say more. But then Theo stirred and she looked down, brushing a hand over his cheek. Malcolm stepped forward and offered his hand again. Hop on, he said. She looked up and this time there was no hesitation. She took his hand. The trail to Great Falls ran wide through shortgrass prairie, the kind that whispered low under sun and wind, stretching near to forever. Malcolm rode with his reins loose and his eyes forward, but his awareness stayed with Laurel behind him, her arms wrapped around Theo, her breath close enough he could feel it when the wind shifted. They didn't speak much that first day. The quiet wasn't heavy, just respectful, like two people learning the shape of silence between them. Laurel rode steady, though Malcolm could sense how careful she was, how every movement around Theo came with a kind of practiced vigilance, like she still expected something to go wrong. That night they camped near a narrow creek, the water shallow but sweet. Malcolm unsaddled his horse while Laurel gathered dry grass and twigs from the cottonwoods. When he struck the flint and the fire caught, she exhaled, crouched by the flames, and pulled out two small bundles wrapped in muslin. She handed him one. Inside were dried apples and cornmeal cakes, soft from the heat of the day. You didn't have to share, Malcolm said, though he took it all the same. I couldn't eat it all anyway, she replied, keeping her eyes on the fire. Besides, you gave me more than one kindness already. Theo stirred on the blanket beside her, his small fists opening and closing in sleep. Malcolm chewed slowly. You plan to settle in Great Falls, if I can find work, she said. I know how to sew, quick hands. And I can read well enough, he nodded. There's a dress shop on the south side near the river. My sister passed through last spring, said the woman there always needs help, especially with fall coming. Laurel looked up, surprised. You think she'd hire someone like me? I think if she's got sense, she will. The fire cracked. Laurel's face lit in the glow, and for the first time she looked less like someone bracing for the next blow and more like someone remembering how to hope. Malcolm tossed another stick on the flames. You said you were from outside Omaha. What was it like there? Flat, she said, half smiling. Cornfields and dust and boys who couldn't sit still through church. My father ran a feed store. I used to sweep the porch every morning before school. You miss it, she thought for a moment. Parts of it, the quiet, the smell of rain on dry earth, but I wouldn't go back. Why not? There's too much I'd have to unremember. Malcolm didn't press her. Instead, he stood, brushing off his trousers. I'll take first watch. You and Theo get some rest. Laurel hesitated. You think someone's following? No, he said. But I make a habit of keeping an eye out. Doesn't hurt to be certain. She nodded slowly and lay down beside Theo, pulling the blanket over them both. Malcolm stood nearby, one hand resting on his rifle, the other tucked into his coat. The prairie was quiet save for the wind and the soft breathing of mother and child. By morning, the sky was a pale blue dome above them, and the grass was wet with dew. Laurel woke with one hand still resting protectively on Theo's back. She sat up slowly, brushing hair from her face. You always keep watch all night? She asked, her voice still rough with sleep. Not always, Malcolm said. Only when it matters. As they packed, she looked at him differently, less cautious, more curious. You ever think about starting over somewhere? She asked as they mounted up. I have, he said. But starting over means letting go of what came before. That part's harder. She didn't reply, but her gaze lingered on him longer than it had before. By the third day, they reached the foothills where the land folded into itself and the air smelled of pine. The trail narrowed and the trees pressed close. Malcolm rode ahead, leading the way through a shallow pass. At one point, Theo began to cry sharp and sudden, the kind of cry that pulled at something deep. Laurel tried to soothe him, but the noise echoed strange in the trees, and she tensed. Glancing around like she expected someone to come crashing through, Malcolm turned in his saddle. "Let me hold him a while. Give your arms a rest." Laurel hesitated. "He don't take to strangers." "Let him decide," Malcolm said, reaching out. She passed Theo over carefully. The baby wriggled, fussed, then settled against Malcolm's chest with a hiccuping breath. Malcolm adjusted his grip, one hand steady around the child's back. "See," he said quietly. "Not so bad." Laurel watched them both, her face unreadable. When they made camp that night, she didn't wait for him to start the fire. She gathered stones, made a ring, and knelt to strike the flint herself. Malcolm watched her from the edge of camp where he was brushing his horse. "You ever think about teaching again?" he asked. She didn't look up. "That part of me feels far away." "Maybe not gone, though." She paused, then met his eyes. "What about you? You ever want more than the trail and a saddle?" He considered it. "I used to think that was enough. Until I saw you walking beside the tracks." She didn't answer, but her eyes didn't leave his face. Later, after Theo had fallen asleep beside the fire, Laurel sat with her knees pulled up, arms wrapped around them. The moon hung low and full, casting silver shadows through the trees. "I never thought anyone would help me without a price," she said quietly. "Not after the last year. I'm not most people," Malcolm said. She turned to him, her expression softer than it had ever been. "No, you're not." He didn't reach for her. He didn't say more. But when she leaned slightly toward him, he stayed right where he was, warm and steady, letting the trust between them grow in the stillness. Rain had come overnight, thin and steady. It left the earth dark and fragrant, soaking into the folds of Malcolm's coat and Laurel's skirt as they rode slow beneath a pale morning sky. The clouds hadn't broken, but the air felt gentler than the day before, as though the land itself was easing with them. They'd passed only one wagon since dawn, an older couple heading south with a mule cart full of hay. Laurel had nodded politely as they passed, but Malcolm saw the way her shoulders lifted with caution until the road widened again. By midday, they stopped near a stand of willows. Malcolm tethered the horse while Laurel laid Theo down on a wool blanket beneath the driest spot she could find. The child was sleeping deeper now, his cheeks no longer flushed, his breath slow and even. She watched him a moment, then stood, brushing her palms on her skirt. "I used to think I'd have a whole house full of children," she said. Malcolm glanced over, pouring water from his canteen into a cup. "You still could." Laurel raised a brow. "You offering to help with that?" He handed her the cup. "I'd be lying if I said the thought hadn't crossed my mind." Her fingers brushed his as she took it. "You don't know me well enough to say that. I know you didn't quit when most would have. I know you carry more than you let on." He paused, voice quieter now. "And I know I'd like to stay close enough to keep learning." Laurel didn't answer right away. She sipped, then knelt back down beside Theo. After a long moment, she said, "Nathan wanted 7, said he'd name them after the months if I let him." A small breath escaped her, not quite a laugh. "We only had Theo." Malcolm crouched across from her, elbows resting on his knees. "You still talk to him, in your head?" "Sometimes," she said. "Mostly when it's quiet." She looked up. "That's strange." He shook his head. "I talk to my father when I sharpen my knife. He taught me how. Always said a dull blade's a man's own fault." Laurel's mouth curved, but it wasn't amusement, it was recognition. Something shared and understood. They didn't ride far that afternoon. The rain returned harder, and Malcolm spotted an old line shack tucked into a hill, likely abandoned by a cattle crew after spring branding. The roof sagged in one corner, but the walls held and the hearth inside was dry enough to take a flame. Malcolm got a fire going while Laurel changed Theo into a dry wrap. She moved about the space with quiet competence, shaking out the blanket, laying their things in neat order, checking the windows for drafts. Once the boy was asleep again, she joined Malcolm near the flames, sitting on the floor beside him. He offered her the last of the jerky from his pack. "I never asked what you did before this," she said. "Before Helena, fought in the war," Malcolm said, then drifted. "Worked cattle, drove freight, built fence in Wyoming one winter. Every place I went, I thought maybe I'd stop, never did. Why not? Didn't have a reason." Laurel considered that, then asked, "You ever been in love?" Malcolm didn't look away. "Once." She married someone steadier. Laurel leaned her head against the log wall, watching the firelight shift across the rafters. I thought I'd grow old with Nathan, had it all pictured, gray hair, a rocking chair, him snoring beside me. Her voice was quiet, not mournful, just honest. But life doesn't ask you what you want. No, Malcolm agreed. But sometimes it gives you what you need. Her eyes met his. And what do you need, Malcolm North? I used to think the answer was somewhere down the next trail, he said. Now I'm not so sure it isn't sitting right in front of me. She didn't speak, but something in her face shifted, less guarded, more open. A long silence passed, broken only by the crackle of the fire. Malcolm didn't move closer. He just sat beside her, steady as the ground beneath them, and let the quiet settle. When she finally leaned her shoulder against his, he didn't startle or speak. He just let it be. They stayed there a long while, not saying anything more, until the fire burned low and the rain eased to a whisper against the roof. The air shifted 2 mornings later, cleaner, thinner, carried down from the high country where the ridges wore snow even through August. They were close to the river now. Great Falls lay just beyond the break of hills, and the trail had widened into a wagon road rutted from summer freight. Malcolm reined in when he spotted a split cedar fence stretching beside a pasture. A few steers grazed under a stand of birch trees, and a dog barked once, low and territorial, from inside a yard farther up. "We'll make town by sundown," he said, adjusting his hat against the sun. "But I know a place near here where we can stop before. Belongs to a man I rode fence with once. He and his wife keep chickens, they won't mind us resting a bit." Laurel looked toward the house in the distance, modest, whitewashed, with smoke curling from the chimney. "We won't be trouble to them." "No, ma'am." He turned the horse off the road. Theo, tied snug to Laurel's chest with a length of cotton cloth, stirred but didn't wake. The couple greeted them at the gate. The man, Wes, was broad-shouldered and sun-browned, with a limp that Malcolm remembered from a mule accident. His wife, Dinah, wore a blue calico apron and had flour on her cheeks from baking. She took one look at Laurel and reached for her hand. "Come in, dear," she said. "You look like you could use a proper chair and something warm." Inside, the house smelled of yeast bread and wood smoke. Laurel sat at the kitchen table, her hands wrapped around a mug Dinah had filled with chicory and milk. Theo lay on a folded quilt in the corner beside the stove, sighing in his sleep. "Do you ever miss staying put?" Laurel asked, watching Malcolm as he helped Wes carry in a crate of eggs from the porch. "There were times I thought I might," he answered, setting the eggs down. "But I never had a reason to plant my boots anywhere long." Dinah looked between them, then turned away, humming as she set out another plate. Outside, chickens scratched at the packed dirt near the shed. Malcolm stepped out to check the sky, already thinking ahead how much longer the weather would hold, what places in town might be hiring, where he could stable his horse if he stayed more than a few days. Laurel came out a moment later, brushing her hands on her skirt. She joined him at the fence line, her face turned toward the wind. "He's getting stronger," she said. "Theo, eating better, sleeping easier?" "He's got you," Malcolm said. She nodded. "I didn't always know if that would be enough." He turned to look at her. "It's more than enough." "You brought him through." The breeze lifted strands of her hair, and she tucked them behind her ear without thinking. Dinah asked if we were married. He raised a brow. "What you tell her?" I said no, Laurel replied. Then I didn't say anything else. Malcolm watched her face. "Would it be a lie if you said yes?" She didn't answer right away, just looked out over the pasture. The cattle moved slow through the grass, tails switching, heads down. "I don't know what comes next," she said finally. "I've been walking so long, I forgot what it feels like to stop." "You don't have to decide today," she turned toward him. "But you'd wait." "I already am." That night, they pitched camp one last time before town, just off the road beneath a row of cottonwoods that rustled like water. Theo slept curled between them, his breath soft against the quilt. "I've been thinking," Laurel said, voice low. "If that dress shop doesn't work out, maybe I could start something small, mending maybe, or schooling the littlest ones. There's always mothers needing help with letters and numbers." "You'd be good at that," Malcolm said. She shifted onto her side, her eyes on him in the flickering firelight. "Would you stay if I did?" "I would," he said. "If you'd have me." A long pause stretched out between them. Then she reached across Theo's blanket, her fingers curling around Malcolm's hand. "I'd have you," she whispered. He didn't speak, didn't move, just held her hand steady until the fire burned low and the stars wheeled overhead. In the hush between one trail and the next, something settled between them, not rushed, not loud, but sure. And by morning, they rode the last stretch into town not as strangers, not quite as sweethearts, but as two people who had walked through the hard places and found, at last, a place to rest. The streets of Great Falls bustled with late summer motion. Wagons rolled slow between storefronts, hooves thudding over packed dust. A smith hammered iron down by the livery, and the scent of yeast and tobacco drifted on the dry wind. Laurel stood beside Malcolm outside the mercantile, Theo pressed close against her hip. The sounds weren't loud exactly, but they crowded her senses after so many days with nothing but wind and hoofbeats. Malcolm waited quietly, reins looped over his wrist, giving her time. He didn't speak until her shoulders eased. "This is where the shop is," he said, nodding toward a narrow building across the way. Names stitched on the awning. A faded sign read Mrs. Hayworth's Dressmaking and Repair. The front window held bolts of cloth stacked in neat pyramids, blues and burgundies catching the light. Laurel drew in a breath and crossed the street. Inside, the air was warm and close, filled with the scent of starch and beeswax. A woman in her middle years stood behind the counter, pinning a collar to a dress form. She looked up as the bell above the door rang. "You need a hem fixed?" she asked, eyes flicking to the wear in Laurel's skirt. "No, ma'am," Laurel said, steadying her voice. "I came to ask about work." The woman's gaze sharpened. "You sew by hand or machine?" "By hand, fast and clean. I can do mending, piecing, full garments if I see the pattern done once." Mrs. Hayworth stepped out from behind the counter, her face unreadable. "You don't sound local." "I'm not." The woman studied her a moment longer, then she nodded once. "Come back tomorrow, I'll set a hem for you. If it's straight, I'll pay you for the day." Laurel nodded. "Yes, ma'am." Outside, Malcolm waited beside the horse. Laurel stepped down the porch and stood beside him, one hand resting lightly on the saddle horn. "She'll test me," she said, "but I'll pass it." "I knew you would," Malcolm replied. That evening, they found a room above the bakery, small but clean, with a narrow bed and a wash basin beside the window. The landlady agreed to let them stay by the week, and gave Laurel a tin basin for Theo's bath and a wooden cradle that had been left by a widow 2 winters back. Malcolm left his horse at the livery and came back with bread, smoked pork, and a wedge of cheese wrapped in paper. Laurel laid Theo down after he'd eaten and curled up in the cradle, and they sat on the floor by the window, knees nearly touching. "You think you'll stay?" she asked. He didn't look away. "I will if you want me beside you." Laurel reached for his hand, not tentative this time but sure. "I want more than that." Malcolm leaned in, slow like the sun lifting through morning fog, and kissed her, his hand rising to her cheek. There was no urgency in it, just the quiet certainty of two people who had already chosen each other, days stacked into weeks. Mrs. Hayworth gave Laurel a permanent place at the work table after the 3rd day, and by the next Wednesday she was trusted with client fittings. Laurel stitched full skirts and ribbon bonnets, her fingers moving faster than the other women's, precise and sure. Malcolm found work hauling grain from the mill to the rail yard. He came home with sawdust in his sleeves and dirt on his boots, but his eyes always found Laurel first. He never missed dinner. Sometimes he brought back a spool of thread or a bit of ribbon, laid quiet on the table without a word. On Sundays they walked to the riverbank. Theo bundled against the breeze and watched the current turn slow beneath the cottonwoods. Sometimes Malcolm would stretch out in the grass, Theo curled on his chest, while Laurel read aloud from a worn booklet of Emerson poems she found at the trading post. One evening, as September neared its end, Malcolm came in with something wrapped in a square of muslin. Laurel was folding linens by the stove. He waited until she looked up, then set it in her hands. Inside was a narrow gold ring, simple and smooth. "I don't want to live by half measures," he said. "Not when I've found the whole of it with you." Laurel stared at the band, then at him. Her eyes were wide, but her voice was steady. Yes, she said, they married before frost came. The church was small, whitewashed, and half full with townsfolk who'd come to know their names. Mrs. Hayworth brought a bouquet of dried lavender. Dinah and Wes rode in from the farm with a jar of honey and a pie wrapped in a towel. Theo wore a little vest someone had sewn from leftover calico and spent most of the ceremony chewing on Malcolm's finger. Afterward, they walked home by lantern light, Malcolm carrying Theo and Laurel's hand tucked into his coat. The night was quiet but full with the kind of peace that doesn't need announcing. Years passed, but the rhythm stayed. Laurel opened a small school in the back of the church, teaching letters to ranch hands' children and arithmetic to widows running their own farms. Malcolm built a fence along the back of the bakery lot, where they planted beans and tomatoes. Theo grew tall and sun-browned, always asking questions, always certain of where he belonged. They never left Great Falls again. Some evenings, when the house was quiet and the lamp burned low, Malcolm would press his forehead to Laurel's and say, "You still take my breath." And Laurel, brushing her fingers through his hair, would answer, "You gave me mine back." They grew older with soft hands and full hearts, their love not loud but deep as river stone worn smooth by time. They had no need to look back. Everything that mattered was right there: warmth, belonging, and the kind of love that holds steady even when the wind rises.